July 1944. The world was burning. Across Europe and the Pacific, the air trembled with the roar of engines, each one a mechanical heartbeat of war. But hidden deep within the quiet hangars of Connecticut, a new kind of monster was being born, not a bomb, not a weapon, but an engine. They called it the R-4360 Wasp Major, 71 liters of fury. 4 rows of 7 cylinders, a machine so vast and powerful, it seemed to defy logic itself. For the men who built it, it wasn't just another engine. It was the beating heart of a dream to push the skies beyond the limits of piston flight. But that dream came with a price. Every bolt, every valve, every roaring test run drew them closer to the edge of madness, because the more powerful it became, the more it fought back. The engine shook apart. Cylinders glowed red heat. And as war demanded faster, higher, deadlier machines, Pratt & Whitney's engineers found themselves racing against both physics and time. This is the story of Wasp Major, a story of obsession, genius, and the last great breath of the piston age before jet engines swept the skies clean of propellers forever. In the early years of the war, engines were evolving faster than the men who flew them. Each month brought a new demand to climb higher, fly farther, carry more, and survive longer. The twin-row radials that once ruled the skies were suddenly not enough. The world's air forces were pushing their machines beyond reason. In Europe, the mighty B-29 struggled for altitude under flak-filled clouds. In the Pacific, long-range bombers crossed oceans where a single engine failure meant vanishing forever. And at the heart of every mission was a simple truth: whoever built the better engine would own the sky. At Pratt & Whitney's quiet East Hartford plant, that truth became an obsession. Engineers stared at blueprints littered with coffee stains and ash burns, searching for something that didn't exist yet, for more power in the same space. The R-2800 was already a masterpiece, the engine that carried Corsairs, Hellcats, and Thunderbolts throughout the war. But it wasn't enough. The generals wanted bombers that could cross continents and fighters that could keep up. So Chief Engineer Leonard Hobbs made a choice no one thought possible: add another row. 4 banks of 7 cylinders of 28 pistons, hammering in rhythm like an orchestra of thunder. It would mean new cooling systems, new superchargers, and new alloys to handle the inferno inside. But if it worked, the engine could produce more than 3,000 horsepower, enough to drag a heavy bomber through the stratosphere. They called it the R-4360 for its cubic-inch displacement. But inside the shop, the mechanics had another name: the corn cob. Because that's what it looked like, a metallic ear of corn, bristling with cylinders, glowing from within. No one knew if it could even survive a full test run. When they first fired it, the ground shook. Windows rattled 3 blocks away. Men watched through glass as the test stand swayed under the torque. The noise wasn't a roar. It was a deep, living growl that seemed to reach into your chest and shake the bones. And then, silent. The engine was seized. Metal tore. Oil bursts across the concrete floor. They'd built a beast they couldn't control, but they didn't give up. Each night, they stripped it down, reforged broken pistons, redesigned cooling fins, adjusted clearances by thousandths of an inch. And slowly, painfully, the Wasp Major began to live. By 1944, it produced nearly 3,500 horsepower. It could power bombers like the B-50 and the Convair B-36 aircraft that would soon touch the edge of the jet's age itself. Yet no one in that dimly lit workshop knew that this engine, their crowning triumph, would also mark the end of everything they'd been fighting for. Because even as the R-4360 thundered to life, another sound was echoing from across the Atlantic into a thin, high-pitched whistle. The sound of the jet. By late 1944, the world had changed almost overnight. From secret airfields in Germany came the scream of something new, something unnatural. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, cut through the air like a blade of silver lightning. To Allied pilots, it felt like science fiction came alive. They called it the Stormbird. It was faster, smoother, deadlier, and it didn't sound like war. It sounded like the future. For the men at Pratt & Whitney, that sound was terrifying. They'd spent years perfecting the piston engine, sculpting every inch of the Wasp Major to be the pinnacle of mechanical flight. And suddenly, the rules changed. Propellers looked old-fashioned. Jet exhaust meant clean, efficient, thrust, no pistons, no valves, no thunderous reciprocation. Just, at a raw speed, yet, back in the States, the war machine couldn't wait for the future. Factories were still pouring out thousands of radial engines every month. The R-4360 wasn't just a project anymore. It was production, and as long as the bombers flew, they needed something reliable, something known. That's how the Wasp Major earned its second life, not in the war's final dogfights, but in the uneasy peace that followed. It would carry the B-29 Peacemaker, a bomber so vast that each wing held 3 engines facing forward and 3 facing backward. 6 propellers are driven by 6 of the most powerful piston engines ever built. The Peacemaker could fly from Texas to Moscow without refueling. It could carry nuclear bombs before jets were trusted to. It was a giant, born in a shrinking world. But every pilot who flew behind those engines knew their secret. The R-4360 was powerful but fragile. Its furrow design made it cool a nightmare. The rear cylinders ran hot, often too hot, and mechanics would joke that you could fry eggs on the back bank. Oil leaks were constant. Maintenance was endless. And yet, despite the sweat, the danger, and the exhaustion, they loved it. Because when all 6 engines roared to full power, the Peacemaker didn't just fly, it commanded the sky. It was the last great sound of the piston era, thunder that rolled across the stratosphere before fading into silence. But even as it climbed higher than any propeller-driven aircraft before it, the jet's age was accelerating below. The Americans had the P-80 Shooting Star, the British had the Gloucester Meteor, and the Soviets were racing to catch up. The piston had given humanity wings, but the jet promised something else entirely, a limitless sky. And so, the R-4360 found itself at a crossroads, an engine of breathtaking brilliance, born just a few years too late. The men who built it could already feel the shift. The smell of oil and burnt metal was replaced by the sterile scent of kerosene. The world they'd mastered was ending. In the years that followed the war, the world entered a strange twilight. Not peace, not war, but something in between. The Cold War had begun to stir, and with it came a new kind of tension, a war of distance, deterrence, and dominance. The skies were no longer battlefields, they were frontiers. And ruling that frontier was the giant's aircraft so enormous they seemed impossible. The Convair B-29 Peacemaker was one of them, a machine built not for dogfights, but for deterrence. 230 feet of aluminum and fear, 6 Wasp Majors turning backwards along the trailing edge of her wings, for each engine for the size of a small car. When all 6 fired together, the vibration alone could rattle teeth loose. To the crew, those engines were alive. They breathed, they moaned, they bled oil like living things. Mechanics joked that the Peacemaker didn't fly it, leaked its way around the world. But deep down, they respected her, because no other aircraft on Earth could do what she did. She could reach altitudes where frost formed inside the cockpit. She could cross oceans without a tanker. And if the order came, she could end the city. But inside those massive nacelles, the Wasp Majors fought for their lives. 4 rows of pistons meant heat trapped deep within. Even with powerful fans and clever ducting, the inner cylinders ran hundreds of degrees hotter than the outer ones. A single valve failure could start a fire that spread faster than any crew could contain. Pilots dreaded the red warning light, that flicker that meant number 3's gone. One former crewman later recalled, "You didn't fly the B-36, you negotiated with it." The Wasp majors had personalities. Some purred, some coughed and sputtered like grumpy old men, and sometimes one would just quit for no reason, no warning. But when everything worked, when all 6 engines and their 4 propellers clawed the air in perfect sync, there was nothing like it. The aircraft would rise like a cathedral moving through clouds, every vibration singing the same metallic hymn. It was mechanical poetry. It was power made from fresh air. Then came the Boeing Stratocruiser, a civilian offshoot luxury born from war. It carried passengers across oceans in comfort, powered by the same Wasp majors that once drove bombers. But even in peacetime, the engine's temper showed. Cracked crankcases, fires, oil starvation, the very things that made it strong, also made it unpredictable. Pilots called it a beautiful curse. Still, Wasp Major refused to fade quietly. It remained the most complex piston engine ever mass-produced, an achievement no one dared replicate. By the early 50s, the jet was already taking over. But for a few briefs, shining years, those giant radials still ruled the skies, thundering symbols of an age that refused to die. Yet behind that thunder was exhausted. The mechanics who worked on them were worn to the bone. 12-hour shifts, burnt fingers, noise that never left the ears. They were keeping alive an engine whose time had already passed. And though they didn't know it yet, every flight, every rotation of those 28 pistons was ticking toward an ending with a quiet, inevitable fade into history. By the mid-1950s, the writing was on the hangar wall. Jet engines were no longer experiments, they were revolution. The sleek, shrieking shapes of the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15 had already turned the skies of Korea into a duel of afterburning thunder. And though Wasp Major still roared in the bellies of bombers and airliners, it was becoming an artifact of a fading world. The B-29 Peacemaker, once the pride of America's strategic command, was already being called obsolete. Its 6 piston engines now shared wings with 4 jet pods, an uneasy marriage between 2 generations of flight. The men who flew her called it 6 turning, 4 burning. It was a slogan of pride and irony. The most powerful piston engine in history was now being carried by the very technology that would replace it. Down below, mechanics worked with grease-stained hands and ringing ears, keeping the old giants alive just long enough for the next era to take over. Each overhaul was a war of patience, each flight gambles. But for all its flaws, the oil leaks, the overheating, the impossible maintenance, the Wasp Major had something the jets never did: soul. It was mechanical storytelling fire, steel, rhythm, chaos, and beauty, all fighting for harmony. When a Wasp Major started, it didn't whine or hum, it came alive. You could feel the ignition spread through its 28 cylinders like a pulse, a heartbeat from another century. And as it roared, you could almost hear the echo of every hand that built it, every sleepless engineer, every test pilot, every mechanic who'd sworn they'd never touch once again, yet always came back. Still, time has no mercy. The world was moving too fast for gears and pistons. Airlines wanted reliability, not romance. The military wanted altitude, not art. And so, one by one, the great radials were silenced. They were wheeled out of hangars, drained of oil, their propellers feathered for the last time. The sound that once shook cities now lived only in memory. To the new generation of pilots, the old engines seemed almost alive with relics of a mythic era when flight was as much felt as flown. To the men who'd served with them, their passing felt personal. They had built machines that breathed fire, and now watched them fade beneath the clean, cold hiss of turbines. In those final years, as the last B-36 seconds were retired and the stratocruisers gave way to jetliners, the Wasp Major became something sacred as the symbol of human persistence against inevitability. It was man's final attempt to make Piston's flight do the dough. Impossible, and it had succeeded, if only for a moment, but that moment was enough. Even after the last Wasp Major roared and fell silent, its shadow lingered in the sky. Pilots, engineers and mechanics carried their lessons into the jet age, the rhythm of engines, the poetry of fire and metal, the delicate balance between raw power and human skill. Every modern radial or turbine aircraft bore a whisper of the Wasp Major's heartbeat, an unspoken acknowledgement of what had come before. Aviation schools still taught its quirks, how to coax life from stubborn cylinders, how to anticipate a temperature spike, and how to respect the temperamental brilliance of a machine designed to dominate the air. Veterans told stories of hair-raising flights, of engines that coughed and roared and then soared like gods, of propellers that cut the clouds into ribbons of light. These were tales of mastery, courage, and obsession, legends that inspired generations long after the last piston plane had been retired. Museums displayed preserved Wasp Majors, polished and silent, but even in stillness, they seemed alive. Visitors could almost hear the vibration in their bones, feel the heat on their faces, sense the thrill of raw, mechanical might. For the world, it was a relic. For those who'd known it, a companion, a challenge, a living testament to human ingenuity. In a sense, the Wasp Major never truly died. It lives in the spirit of aviation, in the pilots who dream of long-distance flights, in the engineers who chase the perfect balance of power and endurance, in the mechanics who honor the old ways while building the new. It was the last great roar of the piston age, the embodiment of a time when flight was dangerous, exhilarating, and profoundly human. And as jets streaked across the sky, smooth and silent compared to the fury of the past, a few would remember. It was once a world ruled by fire and steel, by cylinders that breathed like living beasts, by engines that defined the soul of flight itself. The Wasp Major had left its mark not just in history, but in the hearts of all who dared to take to the air. The sky darkened, tinged with the last glow of sunset, and the hum of distant airfields became a faint memory. A lone Wasp Major, long retired, stood in a hangar, its polished cylinders gleaming under soft museum lights. Dust motes floated lazily, catching the amber rays like tiny sparks from a past age. Outside, the wind whispered through empty runways, carrying echoes of engines that had roared, of pilots who had pushed themselves and their machines to the edge, of stories written in smoke trails across the sky. In the silence, one could almost hear the pulse of the Wasp Major, about the rhythm of pistons, the surge of propellers slicing clouds, the heartbeat of a world where flight was raw, immediate, and alive. Generations had moved on to jets, to supersonic dreams, to quiet cockpits and flawless electronics. Yet, somewhere deep in the DNA of aviation, the lessons of the past endured courage, precision, respect for power, and the beauty of a machine that demanded everything and gave everything in return. A young pilot walks past the Wasp Major, notebook in hand, eyes wide with wonder. Perhaps they will never feel the heat of a radial engine on their face, never wrestled with pistons screaming at 2,700 revolutions per minute. Yet the spirit of the beast will guide them, reminding them that flight is not just a science, but an art, a partnership between humans and machines. The hangar doors close slowly. Shadows stretch, merging the past and present. Outside, the wind picks up again, carrying a faint, distant roar, as if the Wasp Major itself is taking one last victorious sweep across the horizon. The screen fades black. A whisper remains. The legacy of fire and steel, of courage and obsession, will never be forgotten.